Good morning. Welcome to Talk HR UK. I'm Simon Geere, and when I'm not co-hosting podcasts with HR leaders, I'm helping HR directors, managing directors, and CEOs source and recruit the best HR talent in the southeast of the UK. On my left, I'm not sure where you're watching, but on my left is Gavin Russell. Good morning, Gavin.
Good morning.
Some of you who are regulars of Talk HR will recognise Gavin. He is back. He's a regular. Our first regular, so thank you for giving up your time again.
My pleasure.
I wanted to briefly introduce Gavin. So we met back in 2009, a very long time ago. Gavin had a very strong and interesting background within talent and HR, which he'll tell you about shortly. I think you'd finished with EDF and were heading off to Skype at the time, before you went on to Alexander Lloyd, Zapster, and now forming your own organisation. The change and talent consultancy in the HR space, Pepper Moth. So great to have you back. And today we are touching on a subject very close to my heart. Obviously, we're talking about, is it time to redesign recruitment? So hoping you guys in HR and talent acquisition will find this useful. So Gavin, tell us about yourself.
Sure, no problems. Thank you for the intro. Not going to repeat too much stuff that you've already said, but quick background. 20 years in HR change, talent, transformation, that sort of space. Most of that was in doing in-house recruitment turnaround. So it might have been set up turnaround scale. And I did that at places, as you mentioned, like Skype, Microsoft, at Foxtel and at DTZ. And then more recently, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been doing more consulting across the full talent lifecycle, which is manifested in Pepper Moth, which is my own little consultancy. And I also wrote a book, which I published last July. There we go. Thank you for the plug. Called Transformation Timebomb, which is very much about change in the digital age and having some practical solutions to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I genuinely read the book. It's fantastic. And I've seen, it came up on LinkedIn, and I've seen a few more people name checking it. So there's a bit of momentum gathering, getting I choose my words poorly here, but a second wave of interest, I suppose, in terms of the book. So
I'll take any wave. Any wave of interest is good.
Excellent. So on to the matter at hand, really. So today the subject came about, we were talking after we finished our first podcast, and the idea started through an anecdote, didn't it? So do you want to share that context with us?
Sure, absolutely. And I don't know where the anecdote originally came from, and I'm certainly not going to take credit for it. But it's a hypothetical story of a recruitment team. It could be in-house or it could be agency. And they're almost pitching in a Dragon's Den style to the board or to investors, trying to get investment. And the anecdote goes, sort of, please invest in us. Our product is always at least 3 months late, but normally 6. We disengage probably 90% of all the people that we come into touch with, sometimes more. Our product statistically fails 30 to 50% of the time after 12 months. Within the first 12 months. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to replace it if it fails after that 12 months. Oh, and by the way, it costs you 4 or 5 figures each and every time you do it. Now, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, it's a bit sort of exaggerated, but it does illustrate what I perceive to be a fundamental flaw within the recruitment operating model that many organizations and many agencies use, right? It's by default or by design, it's always late. It's quite disengaging in terms of how it runs. It's risky, it's expensive, based upon that amount of risk that you're taking in. And there's a surprisingly low chance of success. So kind of the view and where we got to was, isn't it time we did something about it?
Okay, interesting. And obviously, I'm trying not to take any of this very personally.
I'm an ex-recruiter myself, right? So 12 or whatever it is years in the industry, I feel like I've got a foot in both camps.
Understood. So, obviously there would be those that say, it's a tried and tested model. It's worked very well over the last few decades. There's an awful lot of large, successful businesses that have built their models on this. And at the end of the day, I guess people just want to find the right people for their open roles in their companies. So is it broken? What do you think?
So my view, okay, broken is possibly too strong a way of phrasing it, but I certainly think it's expiring. it's running out of runway. So, and I contextualize that by saying that the business environment that we operate within, that every business operates within, is completely different. Demand has changed, supply has changed, the definition of value, of recruitment value, has changed. And so what that means is that, organizations are at a completely different inflection point. What they need to do is create value through their talent quickly and cost effectively. They've got compressed windows and exploding demand. So recruitment, for me, has moved on from being, let's fill a role in headcount, to how do we create competitive advantage? Because business is moving in much more complex and complicated ways. And so recruitment, for me, can't be about this traditional model of being quite reactive, quite tactical, almost kind of like a factory production line. It's not about getting, filling butts in seats. It's absolutely about getting the right people at the right time, at the right cost, for the right duration, to extract the right results. And that, for me, requires us to have a fundamental look at that model and actually reappraise, is it fit for purpose? Does it do what it should be doing?
Interesting. So obviously we're going to go into that. Let's talk about that in a moment in terms of the reappraisal of the model. But what about the business environment itself and the changes to that that you mentioned? Well, tell us a little more there.
Yeah, well, I do talk about the business environment being completely different. There's the three categories I talked about. There's business demand changing, supply changing, and definition of value changing. So I'll take those in turn. Excuse me. And there's quite a lot in there, so I'll try and do it succinctly. So if we start off with business demand changing, there's 5 things that I see happening and picking up momentum and speed. 1, the talent ownership model is being completely challenged. So you've got economic unpredictability, means the advantages of size and co-location and ownership are diminishing. So large permanent workforces with large real estate just carry a load more risk and a load more liability. And so I'm seeing a decline in the vertically integrated business or the attractiveness of the vertically integrated business. And certainly when I started out, 2 decades ago, the vertically integrated business was everything. That's what the aspiration was. And I think we're getting over a little bit of a tipping point on that. The next thing is we need talent ahead of demand. And I mentioned it earlier on. We've got compressed windows of opportunity. You can't wait 3 or 6 months for a person to turn up. You might have 3 or 6 weeks. You might have 3 or 6 days to be able to extract value or defend against a threat or capitalize on opportunity. So this annual workforce plan and we'll recruit these people in September and those people in January of next year, that just doesn't work anymore. Third thing, I think we're shifting from employment to deployment. So as organizations refocus on outcomes and not outputs, they're updating their structures and they're being more project driven as opposed to functions driven. So it's not about roles, it's about the value that they generate. So we're seeing a shift away from permanent employment, which is about content. How can I get as many people as possible with content skills in this function, towards higher value employees with cognitive skills and being supplemented by specialized project on demand talent. And I know we'll go on to explore that a little bit later on. The fourth thing, agile businesses need an agile workforce. So as demand and complexity increase, organizations need those new recruitment structures, new workflows, new processes, new systems that keep up with the volume, the variety, and the velocity of change, right? And so the demand that's going in for recruitment teams is completely different, just in terms of the volume of what they've got to do and how quickly it's coming at them and the breadth of the challenges they face. And the final thing under this heading is about employment brand. And I absolutely see at the moment employment brands becoming a cornerstone of the commercial offering. So we all know about organizational culture being, a major window or a critical shop window for customers to look at businesses and evaluate their value, evaluate their ethics, their sustainability, their social impact. An employment brand, or indeed talent brand, which is what's evolving into, is absolutely that shop window that people are evaluating it by. And that massively elevates the demand on recruitment teams to get employment branding or talent branding right. Think of any retail bank in the last 9 months that hasn't used its employees in its adverts. And you'll start to get a sense of, Now you'll switch on the TV, you'll start to see pretty much most adverts, Amazon warehouses or whoever else it might be, are using employees in their advertising because they get that is a huge conduit between customer value, or the perception of customer value, and loyalty, and how businesses are successful. So there's a lot there, but so that's the first 5 on business demand. I'm switching gears a little bit here, and I'm going to talk about the supply changing. And there's 4 things I'm going to talk about here. I see absolutely the balance of employment power shifting. So you've got multi-generational, more diverse motivations in the workforce. We know about generation, or the baby boomers and Generation X, and we're familiar with Generation Y, but crikey, you've got a whole Generation Z coming through that is fundamentally changing the dynamic within the employment relationship. And these are people that are looking for shared values. They're not going to fix themselves to fit in to organizations. They're not going to wait for slow moving succession plans. They're much more proactive in trying to find organizations that reflect them. And so it's changing how organizations manage those experiences and manage the reputation, manage their brand within that particular space. Second thing, hypergrowth of independent and outsourced workforce. Now, a lot of people talk about the gig economy in sort of quite a negative sense. And that's partially true. I sort of look at the gig economy as an hourglass-shaped market. And at the bottom end of that hourglass shape, you've got the delivery drivers and such like who are having a tough time of it and will continue. I mean, it's going to get worse before it gets better for that community. But we cannot ignore the fact or ignore the people at the top end of that hourglass who are not only happier, but they are wealthier and they're working shorter hours. And so you've got a growth of this marketplace where people are actually taking control of their careers. They're taking the portfolio option, or they're running their own businesses, or whatever it might be, and they're getting a lot more control and enjoyment out of working independently. And part of that is obviously technology is decoupling people from local, or companies from local supply, so they can look anywhere. So you've got a globalization of that talent. And then the final thing to talk about here is sharing, replacing, owning. So you've got brand new talent supply models that are coming on board. So think of companies like Hoxby or Cloud Factory or Upwork, who are all, I would argue, or I would suggest, first generation versions, but they are signs of things to come. As those marketplaces evolve and stretch, they will become much more polished versions, or there will be much more polished versions of each of those new talent supply models that we've never had beforehand. And I think that's a really interesting thing that recruitment teams and recruiters and agencies have to deal with, which is there's a supply that's coming from completely new sources that they hadn't had to deal with beforehand. Okay, and then the last thing, before I let you give you a chance for some airtime, is the definition of value has changed. And there's 3 things I'll talk about here. I think that talent today has to solve fundamentally different problems to what it used to have to solve. So those problems have to be solved much more frequently. So we are talking about a workforce that isn't going to be repeating the past, because what we used to do doesn't work anymore because the world is different. So it's not about repeating the past, it's about creating new futures. And that's a huge impact on the talent that we hire, but very importantly, how we assess that talent, how we define what that is, how it adds value to our organizations. The second thing is that, and as an output of that, cognitive skills are overtaking or becoming more important over content-based skills. So we've got the half-life of skills plummeting. AI and automation are filling the gap of repeatable transactional work. New technology is coming and going, and that's an important part, faster than we've ever had it beforehand. So it's not so much do you have skills in this particular technology or this particular transaction, it's do you have the ability to deal with change? Do you have the ability to solve problems? So businesses not only need to identify what those are, but they need new ways of building capability, capacity, and competence in a different set of attributes. And then the final bit on here is people are the key factor of production. And they're also, and increasingly, the key source of competitive advantage. It is people that enrich corporate reputations. It is people that personalize experiences. It is people that differentiate offerings and deliver essential new products or create new IP. It's people that do the holy grails of customer loyalty and trust. So getting the right person is so much more important. So the emphasis here, I think I'm saying, is it's quality over quantity. And that, again, leads into this idea of recruitment can't be a factory production line anymore, when it's absolutely about getting those individuals that are game changers and continue to be game changers for an organization versus filling a butt in a headcount spreadsheet.
It's a really interesting point. So when I talk to you, Gavin, you say it faster than I can process it. and I'm thinking, oh, yeah, you know, so many issues, and you're right. I mean, and this is obviously, you know, you touch on this a lot in your book as well. It's things have changed at such pace, and obviously, you know, legacy employment in organisations hasn't. That I think we do. You know, it's just so much to think about. I mean, staying with that, why do you think these current models then, so the status quo at the moment, is struggling to cope with the changes you talk about? You know, what do people like me, what do recruiters need to focus on?
Okay, so there's a lot we could cover off here. Buy the book. Very cheesy plug, but look, I'm going to just talk about 6 things, I think, here, and again, try and be succinct. I'm going to start off with the fallacy of production efficiency, and that's a complicated sounding phrase, but basically, production efficiency is the idea of services at lowest cost by incrementally improving operational processes to increase outputs and tightly control inputs. So, you know, it's an output of scientific management of the production line, pioneered by Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford? I don't mean Gerald Ford, do I? He was the president of the United States. I got that one wrong, but I think you know what I mean. This whole production line mentality, which did work. It did serve us sort of certainly through the 80s and 90s and into the early part of the noughties. You know, it sort of assumes a broadly predictable market. You know, plans are fixed, they're linear, and they're stable. But of course, the demand isn't fixed anymore. Plans are not stable. Everything is moving. It's utterly unpredictable. So this idea of incremental efficiency does not address the growing demand for innovation, for new solutions, for new markets, for constantly evolving much higher value outputs. And I think there's too many models that are too slow, they're too rigid, they're too focused on this sort of cost saving, squeeze everything we can out of it, but keep it pretty much the same. I'd actually argue that a focus on incremental efficiency increases risk and increases problems because it diverts attention away from the real stuff that's happening outside the business. And so I absolutely see that. And that's probably illustrated through the next point and through an experience I had, which is too many recruitment teams I perceive are just inward focused only. They only look at what's going on inside their business and they sort of ignore what's going on outside their business. You know, I've been to a few recruitment conferences in my lifetime, obviously, but I went to a couple last year and one at the beginning of this year that was done remotely. And, you know, lots of interesting debate that was going on, but what I was overwhelmingly, or what struck me really overwhelmingly, was how much of the content was exactly what I was talking about when I used to speak at those recruitment conferences 15 years ago. It was the same things we were saying. It was about, you know, efficiency. It was about speed. It was the same content, and that just didn't square with what I knew was going on outside the business. I didn't see anyone in these conferences talk about the hyper growth of the independent marketplace. I mean, for the independent marketplace, for example, McKinsey said that this is the human cloud. I think they came up with the term. 20 to 30% of all working age population in US and EU in 2016 was working independently. Their model, or actually I think it was Forbes that predicted or built on the model, said that it was going to be 50% by 2027. So if you think about that, we're talking about, I think the number was about 140 million working age people that were independent. They're talking about a doubling of that number, roughly. Now, it remains to be seen whether that's true or not. And obviously that didn't counter coronavirus and all the things that were going on at the moment. But the point I'm making is no one was talking about that. No one had even thought about the independent marketplace. It was very much of, you know, we're just making things more efficient. And this is how well we've done with our efficiency. And it just didn't, it was conspicuous by its absence. Let's put it that way. Third thing I would say, in terms of the operating models that I've seen, is that we've confused digitized for digital. And what I mean by that is we've taken a lot of older existing processes and we've just put them in the cloud, right? Or we've put them online, we've bought a new bit of technology. Now, there are some great products out there that do some really great things, but if you've got a poor process, just putting it online or putting it in a digital framework does not make it better. You know, a crap process is a crap process, whether it's online or offline. And so there's a big difference there in understanding how processes should be transformed through digital as opposed to digitizing what we've already got. And I've actually seen quite an increase over the last few years of quite a lot of recruitment gimmicks out there, things that have, products that have taken, existing, a short-lived trend and new technology, and they've smushed them together and gone, isn't this great? And it really kind of, it's nice, but it's not powerful. It doesn't address underlying commercial need. And I think digital offers a boon to recruiters, but that does not mean that all digital products are valuable. And I think that's an important thing for recruiters to understand. The fourth thing here, too much focus on stakeholders and not enough on users and customers. So, there's a difference between a user, who is people that actually use your product and your services, that go through your processes, that experience what you do. Customers who have a need that your organization is trying to satisfy. So they are still going to be the recipients of what it is you do, albeit indirectly. And stakeholders, who tend to be internal leaders who have an interest in your products and services for whatever reason it might have. Now, we seem to have built most of our models, or certainly, and I'm as guilty or was as guilty of this as the next man, that we were building our models around stakeholders and not around users and customers. So we would build models that were about, well, the finance director wants to make sure we don't exceed this particular number. And we'd ignore, when we built that model, we totally ignore the user experience or the customer experience. We totally ignore how individuals, the quality of the individual at the end of it. It kind of, as long as you don't exceed this budget number, you're being measured on your, back to my phrase, butts in seats, yeah. Which seems so counterintuitive when we're talking about value, when we're talking about people being the key factor of production and making the difference between success and failure. Why are we measuring our success? Why are we gearing our processes to what individual stakeholders need in the business? Why are we ignoring those others? And I'm not suggesting we ignore stakeholders. What I'm saying is we need to get the balance right between all three of those groups, because it's been far too heavily weighted towards individual stakeholders within the business. The next thing, adaptability and agility. Agile HR is, as we probably discussed last time, I think, is the thing that everyone is talking about, is the focus of what most organizations are trying to move towards in an HR community or in an HR sense. And what I'd question is, when was the last time your TA team actually created or tested a brand new idea? And how frequently do they do it? Remember, Agile is about, fast, rapid, easy change. So how often are people making rapid changes within recruitment teams? Or how often are they showing a collective intelligence to create brilliant new solutions? And, here again, I'm not talking about those sort of incremental new solutions. I'm talking about something totally different, like building a prototype or stripping out workflows or designing a completely new candidate experience. So, think about that and ask yourself, how much has your recruitment model changed since you started in recruitment? How much is that core framework? How much has it evolved? And then ask yourself, how much has your business changed over the same time? Are you still delivering the same products and services as you were beforehand? Has the leadership of your business changed? Has technology changed? Do your candidates expect different things? And I suppose it's squaring the circle between those two things. If demand is so different, viscerally, literally from your business, has your model changed to adapt to it? And I've not seen a huge change in that, as demonstrated by the conferences I went to. People are still talking about the same things. If you've adapted, well done. You're doing brilliantly, and all power to you. But if not, I think that there's a really big question that you need to answer there. And then the final thing is obviously talent expectations. I talked about the new generations beforehand, but they expect less friction, less fuss, shorter, higher value experiences. So you can't we can't standardize the way that we used to. We can't look at compliance and risk and focus on protecting ourselves. We've got to look much more on how do we expand the experience? How do we optimize the experience? Reputation is everything, as I mentioned earlier on. So, you know, we've gone from push to pull marketing. We've gone from making sure that all experiences matter. You know, and the BA betrayal, which was a good example in the UK that happened at the beginning of this year, which is a rewrite of really how most candidates perceive recruitment functions. Is you've got to have a much more positive experience. So there's a lot I've given you there, and I've talked at length, but there's so much that I think recruiters need to refocus on to ensure that what they're doing in terms of their operating model is fit for purpose.
No, you make some really good points, and it gets you thinking straight away. And I think there is a risk and a danger of talent acquisition purists or specialists. There is a repetitious nature to it, and I think to break that cycle and become more creative and stand back and re-examine is not natural to everyone, and it's the people that have done that are standing out in the industry now. So, well, based on that, I mean, what questions should talent acquisition leaders be asking themselves? Should recruiters be asking themselves now?
But there's a bunch. And obviously each organisation, and therefore each recruitment function and each recruitment agency supplying a particular market sector, they're all at different inflection points, they're all at different sort of points of their journey. And so there is not a simple answer to this. But the sorts of questions that I would be asking would be, as the talent ownership model is changing, how does that reshape recruitment strategy, right? If we're not going to have as many permanent employees, and I do think permanent employment obviously it's plummeted during coronavirus. It's not going to come back. I just cannot see the environment, the socioeconomic and the market forces to bring permanent employment back to anywhere near what it was beforehand. So I'd be asking, what does that mean for my recruitment strategy? What does that mean for my recruitment operating model? So next one, how do you get ahead of demand when you've got even less chance of knowing what demand is, right? Technology is coming and going as fast as it is. Markets are forming and crashing faster than ever. How do you accurately forecast ahead when there's even less chance of actually of capturing the data and having any sense of predictability about it? And let alone build a presence in new talent markets and then a good compelling message, an EVP that connects with those individuals in those markets. How do you evolve your delivery model to deliver more project-based on-demand talent versus just permanent roles? And then the final one I'll just leave you that moment is, how can you effectively assess cognitive over content? And I blog about this quite a bit because it is something that sort of really gets, that I see as a huge opportunity for recruitment, is how do we look at the cognitive skills that are going to make the difference for our organizations versus the content skills that repeat the past. And there's some good products out there, but I don't see a lot of organizations switching away from this very traditional view of, have you done this? Have you rolled out this product? Have you used this technology? Have you done, managed this budget with these people doing X, Y, Z? Prove to me that you've done all this beforehand so you can repeat it again, knowing that that's pointless because you're not going to be repeating it again because you'll have to do something different in the future. So I think that's a huge question that recruiters, both of agency and in-house, really need to address.
No, you make a really good point. I was talking to someone who I used to work with, actually, who's gone into a much larger global blue chip, and he's doing work on this as we speak. I think we did discuss this before, about ditching the competency-based piece and the untapped potential that so many organizations are missing out on by purely testing what happened because it's a predictor of what will happen. Because you're right, everything is changing so quickly now that it's just developing at pace, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, there are some really great tools out there. I was on a Twitter exchange, let's call it that, yesterday, with someone who said, that's all well and good. How can you, that's too much, that's too challenging. How do you assess that? And I'd argue, actually, recruiters have got all those tools already, right? A competency-based interview, far from perfect, but it's still a really strong framework. it's the attributes that we're assessing that needs to change, as opposed to the framework. So, I talk, and I know we'll come on to this later on, but we shouldn't be saying, how much, let's use technology and say, have you got 5 years worth of Python, C++, whatever it might be, to how have you solved problems beforehand with a distributed team? You're still using the same sort of assessment framework, but you're changing the attributes, the competency that you're evaluating. I actually don't think it's a huge leap technically to repivot on that. But it seems to be a huge leap to do it psychologically, for organizations to break away from the past and go, I'm not going to say that person must have had 5 years doing that, to that person must show me how they've solved problems, or how they've encouraged collaboration, or how they've led a distributed team to produce a particular output. I think that's the biggest challenge there.
That's very interesting. So, well, I mean, to throw it to you then, if you had a blank sheet of paper, and I think sadly a number of organizations do at this point and are thinking about, the way forward, I mean, how would you rebuild the operating model?
I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier on, which is there is no one size fits all. And I think that's a really important point. We shouldn't be carbon copying someone else's model. What works for Google and what works for Skype might not work for Spotify, and it might not work for, I've used technology example there, but the same is true in any industry. Each organization, I firmly believe that each organization is actually like an organism, right? It's uniquely adapted to its environment. And so, borrowing someone else's model is a bit of a Frankenstein's monster. You're cobbling together someone else's limb with someone else's head with another animal's body, whatever it might be. It doesn't work. So it has to be very much organic and internal. And so you need to create your own operating model. And where that starts is actually starting from defining your customers, your stakeholders, your users, defining what their jobs, pains and gains are. What is it that they're trying to do? What can't they do when they're trying to do that? What causes them pain? What frustrates them? What isn't working? And what are the things that would be transformational in doing that? And I'm talking about that with several different groups of stakeholders when it comes to recruiters. So I'm not just talking about your finance director, your HR director, and the CEO. I'm also talking about investors or owners. I'm also talking about line managers. And I'm also, very important, talking about candidates, right? And talent as they work through, and your HR colleagues, because, important point, this all flows through. Individuals have a singular experience of an organization. It's only HR that decides to compartmentalize it into functions, which makes no sense because the whole process and experience breaks down. But we'll come on to that later on. But I think that's absolutely, you've got to go back to those jobs, pains and gains that are really causing stress for your customers, your stakeholders, your users. And then identify your value proposition. What do you do brilliantly, or what can you do brilliantly that addresses those pains and gains, right? What have they told you, this kills me, or oh, if only, what do you do that enables that? And the one way I always encourage people to look at is to identify areas of value creation or value at risk. So recruiters have to be much better at understanding what their business does. It's not their process, not their function. What makes their business successful? So that's thinking like an investor, that's thinking like a customer, that's thinking like your client. And then looking back to this outside in bit, defining clear and simple measures of value from each of those segments, right? And then build around that. So how do you define the relationship? How do you define the channels that do that? The activities, the partners that you might need to be able to deliver that value? What I'm really sort of advocating here is that you've got to build your recruitment function like a business, not like a support function. You need to think in a value add, value generating mindset, as opposed to a cost reduction support mindset. And that goes on to sort of what I would say would be the key principles that I would encourage any recruitment function to look at. Stop aspiring to be a functional partner, start aspiring to be a commercial leader. And that was, I think, the topic of our previous podcast. Your model has to constantly evolve to keep up with change. So you need to embed in there an agile, almost entrepreneurial approach to what you're doing, not a support approach. It's not about sort of coming up with a production efficiency, the most efficient process, and keeping it rigid. It's about that dynamic flow and ebbing and flowing based upon a clear understanding of what value is and what your customers, your users, your stakeholders say. And you've got to make change fast, focused, and frequent. Agile is about that easy, fluid change. It should be easy, it should be quick. Too much change, and certainly what I see when people do change is, it's huge technology implementations, or it's, here's our 3-year change program. And of course, large-scale change programs, they sort of lock people into past decisions that might have expired by the time you get there. By the time they might have expired by the following year. So you've got to make sure that change is agile, and you do that by liberating your teams to find the right solutions. So yeah, those are probably the 3 key principles I would talk about: constant innovation, experimentation, liberate your teams, and make change fast, frequent, and focused.
Okay. So, I mean, we talk about the operating model a bit there and the mechanics of it. Recruitment itself, so the individuals involved and the thinking there, what initiatives should they be focusing on to evolve, basically, and be future ready?
So again, it's back to guiding principles as opposed to rules, because what works for one company isn't going to work for the other one. The first one I talk about is speed to value, not speed to service. And this is it sounds like a convoluted, complicated sentence, but it's actually a gentleman called Sandy Ogg, who was the CHRO of Unilever, I believe it was, for a couple of decades, and then he's gone on to run his own business. He went into private equity. And he had this experience of realizing what private equity does is they make sure they buy the right asset at the right price with the right opportunity, but they also look at extracting value quickly. So for him, it was about having the right people in the right place at the right time to extract that value in that compressed timescale. And I think that's absolutely true of any organization now. I mean, we might not all be owned by private equity investors. We might be VC, we might be independent, we might be private. But the principle, I think, applies across all of those fronts. And so you need to look at speed to value, not speed to service, which is a huge shift from what I've seen many recruitment functions do over the last 10 years. Now, that might be about removing operational drag. So we want to be focusing on a minimal viable process, not a maximum one. It's not about focusing on reducing all risk. It's about maximizing the opportunity to get there, and really being very critical about, is it necessary? Is that really a tangible risk? Am I comfortable with that level of risk if it's got this level of value? It's about repositioning recruitment. We have to confront this legacy barrier that recruitment, and indeed most of HR has, which is still a support function. It really can't be anymore. And part of the way of doing that, you've got to change the metrics. This whole idea of time to fill and cost per hire and butts in seats, they're interesting, but they're not valuable. Honestly, that does not create value for an organization, or you focus on those. They are interesting in terms of having a sense of how your operation is working, but the bottom line has to be about creating value. So that we need to change the metrics across most recruitment functions to make sure that we communicate that clearly back up to our leadership. And we've got to be much more alert to the market and the industry forces and the macro trends that are going on. So I would encourage any recruiter to stop just thinking internally and looking at, is my process efficient and are my customers, are my internal line managers happy? And look outside. What's going on in the marketplace? Who's doing what? What technologies are disrupting my industry? Not my recruitment industry, but the marketplace that I'm supporting. How does that impact the skills? How does that impact demand? What's the US doing? What's macroeconomic policy doing around the world? How does that change investment? We need to have a much better commercial understanding of the business environment before we can build the right model to add value to our organizations. Next one, getting ahead of the demand curve. Now, if I was to try and put this into practical terms, I think we've got to get to this next generation workforce planning. So I think I said earlier on, annual workforce plans are I just don't see value in an annual workforce plan beyond the first month. And then after, it's not really relevant anymore. So I think we've got to move to a always on, dynamic, constantly updated workforce plan that takes that external information and constantly allows us to plug in what demand is going to be and therefore what supply should be. And I think we have to look at cognitive as well as content skills. We have to look at where, when, and how long those skills are necessary, because that changes whether we go down the permanent route or whether we go down on demand. We have to look at supply chain, and whether we are just applying this for permanent hiring as well as any of our external on-demand suppliers. And I'd argue we need a dedicated team to do that, to make sure that you've got that constantly operating. I think you need, second, recruiters need to connect to a much larger, more diverse talent supply base. So there's, as I said, there's these new ones that are growing like Hogsby, like Cloud Factory, like Upwork, who are first generation, but they're growing very rapidly and evolving and getting better at what they do. I think we've got to really find what those organizations are and connect to them. Build, almost automate the supplier workflows to make it simple to integrate with them. You don't want to have to rebuild the process every time, because that's going to be an increasing volume of traffic will need to come from those environments. And then last bit on this bit is a mechanism to leverage existing or internal talent. So I think it was Accenture that came up with the term liquid workforce. And it kind of feels like it's died a death recently, but I still see that as so important as an opportunity to harness the power of internal talent. And I think recruiters have a huge role to play in that, because the closer they are to that, the easier it is to find out what you need externally to be able to deliver that value. And if you have a clearer picture on that, it's much easier to do your job. And then the final thing on this would be creating demand across all supply. And this goes back to the point of how do you plan ahead? The point I made earlier, how do you get ahead of demand when you can't accurately forecast? We've got to create the demand in all the environments that you're likely to be able to nurture and encourage that before you actually know if there's a need or not. So I would talk about building and reshaping experiences to address a much wider set of motivations. You've got to have congruent experiences across the talent lifecycle, not just in recruitment. Got to have quality experiences, particularly the emotionally charged moments of truth that talent has when they come into a business. So that's not just at the offer stage, but that's day one or performance management. Those need to be congruent. We've got to drop this idea of recruitment sitting as a separate function that just does what recruitment does and ignoring what HR generalists do or HR business partners do or learning and development do. It is, as I said beforehand, all part of the same life cycle. That's how stakeholders see it, that's how clients see it, that's how candidates see it. We've got to be much more, when we're talking about experiences, we've got to take a much more life cycle approach to all of those and not just a functional bottom-up approach to them. And then next bit, give more to get more. So you've got to invest much more in adding value to your target audiences and candidates and hiring managers and HR colleagues. Building a story here. And that's then building on, and the final bit I'd say on this is building those communities and relationships. So connecting to new platforms, building authentic, benign presence in those environments, investing in other people's success. So at that point, a demand comes up, you've already got a relationship, you've already got trust, you've already got a degree of loyalty because you've invested in their future success. You've already got a much better chance of finding what you need and when you need it. I've just seen my window cleaner turn up.
I think I saw him earlier, actually, and I was hoping he knows he's there.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm hoping so too.
So, thank you. There's a lot to think about there. I mean, clearly, you feel very strongly that recruiters, the people themselves need to change. They need to be different people. They perhaps need to change their skill set and their mindset to enhance and develop and move with the times. I mean, what would you recommend? What skill set and mindset should we be looking? And I take this on board myself. What do I need to enhance and develop to do a better job?
I talk about evolve as change seems like it's like an accusatory, you've done it wrong. And that's not the case at all. I think what recruiters have done over the last couple of decades is do what they were asked to do, right? And so they've evolved the skills and the attributes necessary to be successful. But now the external marketplace has changed, they need to evolve as well. So I talk about it very much as an evolution versus revolution, if that makes sense. But with that context in mind, I'm going to go back to my favorite phrase, cognitive versus content. And I'm going to start off with the cognitive skills, because I think this is what really will set talent acquisition apart in the future. Is that there's four things I prioritize, or I think are important. First one is entrepreneurialism. And when I talk about entrepreneurialism, I'm not talking about, going out and taking financial risk or doing something just for the sake of doing it, or trying things without thinking it through. What I'm talking about here is intellectual versatility, problem-solving skills, constant curiosity, inquisitiveness. You know, the understanding that I'm not just completing a factory process, I'm not just pushing stuff through this process. I need to constantly think about how I'm adding value and how I'm solving problems that will come up, because there will be many more problems that come up the more the world and the market changes. Customer centricity, which is part of entrepreneurialism, looking at experience, not service. And it frustrates me, and has done for some time, that we mistake customer experience for customer service. You can have a great customer service but not solve any problems. You can have a great customer service, which is, we've done everything that we said we were going to do, but you can be more upset at the end of that call than you were at the beginning, even though the service has been appropriate and you've got them back in touch with them in whatever SLA it is, and you've said all the right buzzwords. I think recruiters absolutely need to know the difference between experience and service. And a good example, go to Zappos, who are leaders, not the recruitment team, their customer team are leaders at that particular skill. Courage, decisiveness, prioritization. Being a recruiter requires a lot more courage now than I think it ever did, because we've got to have some pretty tough conversations with people about what works and what doesn't. And this, to me, comes back to the salient point about recruitment needs to be leaders, not support service. Right? We need to lead commercial outcomes, not transact tasks. And that does require courage. It requires decisiveness. It requires that prioritization. The next cognitive skill I think is critical is divergent thinking. Now, divergent thinking is described as the building block of creativity and innovation. So what I mean by that is you don't need to be a creative, you don't need to be an innovator, but you do need to have a sense of thinking differently about challenges. And if you think about design thinking, which is obviously a hot topic within most industries at the moment, and will increasingly be so within the HR space, divergent thinking is a precept, or it's a foundation stone within that. If you want to explore more about that, look at videos by Sir Ken Robinson, who's an educator. Sadly, I think he died a couple of months ago. But he describes divergent thinking incredibly well. And I think that's, as complexity and demand increase, recruiters need to be much more innovative. And I think having that divergent thinking attribute is critical. The next one, digital literacy. Now, again, this is not about technical knowledge, but this is acknowledging the fact that human-machine relationships are going to deepen. Technology is part of our life. Having digital literacy is about combining critical reasoning and social skills with the ability to provide digital solutions to commercial requirements. So it's, as I said, technology comes and goes. So it's not being technical. It's about having the understanding of how you apply digital solutions to particular problems. And then the final one is EQ. Now, EQ being emotional intelligence. Here I talk very much about building kinship. And so kinship here is about creating communities, but also managing your emotions and the emotions of others within those communities. And this, to me, that's a critical skill that underpins collaboration and problem solving. More distributed teams working in much tighter timescales across more functional sectors. Collaboration is absolutely vital, and collaboration is underpinned if we don't have the EQ to be able to facilitate that collaboration. We can't solve problems if we're not talking to each other and not sharing data. So to me, EQ is, it's coaching, it's influence, it's collaboration, it's trust, it's loyalty. It's kind of thinking about how every relationship that any recruiter does is about an asset that will grow in value versus a transaction that ticks a box on a spreadsheet. So that's the cognitive skills. In terms of content skills, I phrased this with, or I contextualized this with when I started off in recruitment all those years ago. Recruitment was really just a sales model, and I was in recruitment sales in the end of the 90s, and then I went in-house at the beginning in the noughties, and we just used the same model, right? It was the same operational sales model that we borrowed. And I think we've probably used that pretty much that same model for most of the last 20 years. But I do see a massive sea change now in sales and promotion being replaced by advocacy and influence. So that means the skills, the physical, the content-based skills that recruiters need have to evolve away from what I would traditionally associate with sales and promotion towards community management. And I absolutely think that recruiters will need to be expert at nurturing large groups, building an authentic and benign presence, building trust, community, a sense of collective purpose with external communities and internal communities. I think there's a brand leadership piece in here as well, which is connecting people to purpose. Right back at the beginning of our conversation, we talked about organizational culture being like a critical shop window. And I think recruiters have such an important role in communicating brand, talent brand, but arguably speaking, organizational brand, because they are not being separated in the eyes of clients, customers, candidates, to be able to communicate that very clearly and effectively. So that's about storytelling. That's about creating exciting content. That's about being able to communicate and engage people about mission, vision, and values, whatever it might be. I think I referred to it in previous blogs as we're moving from mining to farming. And I think that's a really important differentiation for a recruiter. And then the last couple of points in terms of content skills. I think business process re-engineering is actually vital, because we've got to be constantly creating new experiences. We've got to cut down this organizational drag. We've got to cut down the extraneous steps, actions, rules that don't actually add commercial value. And we've got to re-engineer around users and around customers, as well as around stakeholders, to ensure that those individuals have great tasks. So being able to re-engineer, having a good sense of that overall business process re-engineering, really important. Breadth of knowledge across the entire HR lifecycle. As I said before, you can't sit there and just go, I just do recruitment and I'll let everyone else do everything else. You have to look at it from a candidate point of view and a stakeholder point of view and a client point of view. It's the entire life cycle. And again, of course, but down to that final one, which is being able to assess cognitive ability versus content ability. And I talked about it earlier on, so I won't repeat myself, but I think that being much more astute at understanding what behaviors are important and spotting, and being good at spotting and advising your internal client base on what behaviors are really going to be important and will make a difference and what won't. I think that will be a differentiator as everything else gets automated.
Hey, Gavin, thank you. There's so much to think about here. And what I hope will happen is that HR leaders will listen or watch this and think about what their plans for their own in-house talent acquisition teams are next year and how they need to change. Have they got the right people with the right skill set and mindset, more importantly, in place, but as much as how they do it, as much as the mechanics. And equally, people in my boat, whether it be that sort of agency consultancy side or in-house talent acquisition professionals, there's a lot to think about, digest, and almost, hold the mirror up to yourself and think about, how do I need to evolve next year to stay at pace with the market, with the technology, and the changing demands of demographic demands. And I see it hilariously. My son had his first job interview this week with a well-known high street supermarket chain. Who use
It'll be appearing in their adverts soon.
I know, but it's sponsored by, and they use a very well-known online tool, actually. And it was really interesting for me just to see how well they managed the experience all the way through. Do you know what I mean? And I was impressed. It lacks a certain personal touch. Perhaps I'm showing my generation here, because he didn't care, whereas I did. I was like, oh, but it would have been good to have a little more dialogue after the event, but generally speaking, it just as an aside, it's very interesting to see how it's changed so much from a job, literally the same job at the same place I had when I was his age, which is a bit depressing, really.
Yeah, well, it's a fantastic yardstick. And look, I think there are some recruitment functions, some HR functions out there that are doing a stellar job, that are leading a lot of innovation in this space. And it's exciting to see where they go. But I would also say that just because what they're doing is they're inventing what's right for them. I think the key message I would leave for any person listening or watching this would be, you've got to create what's right for you. And you can't do that until you really understand the commercial context, the business environment, and the level, what the definitions of value are for your business, and where you are on your business journey. If you do that, if you start off there, and then liberate your team to be able to come up with their own ideas. I firmly believe that in most organizations, they've already got the intelligence, the talent, the knowledge, the experience to actually come up with great ideas. It's just we don't normally let them because we say let's sit with this fixed model and continue doing it. How good would it be if we could liberate them to create what they want to do? Because not only would that mean much greater ownership, much greater control, but much better experiences for candidates, clients, stakeholders. And I think there's a win-win scenario there if we can just kind of let go of the past and embrace this new reality. Because I think it's very exciting once we do that.
I agree. Hey, thanks so much for your time as always. It's been great to talk to you again, Gavin. We're aiming for I think mid to late November release here once we've gone through all the process. So obviously, people, as before, please feel free to reach out to Gavin directly via LinkedIn or I know your website, Pepper Moth.
Yeah, peppermoth.live. There's a contact me page there. I'm very happy to chat to anyone.
That's great. Hey, enjoy the rest of the week. I don't know if the US president's been announced whilst we've been recording this. We will we'll find. I don't know if it'll ever be announced, frankly, the way it's going.
I think we're safe for a couple more hours. Yeah.
All right, fabulous. Have a great week. I'll speak to you soon, Gavin.
Thanks, Simon. Take care. You too.